I introduce the congressman, I just want to recognize some dignitaries that are in the audience with us today. We have Representative Nancy Murphy, if you can raise your hand, from Merrimack. Representative Kathy Stack from Merrimack. Representative, you're going to hear a little bit of a theme here. Representative Rosemary Rong from Merrimack. Representative Bruce Cohen from Nashua. Representative Liz McConnell from Brentwood. Former Representative Mindy Mesmer. From the Merrimack Village District, we have Don Provencher, who is a commissioner. We have Ken Ayers, who is a commissioner. From the Merrimack Town Council, we have Barbara Healy. We have Councilor Bill Boyd, who's over there. And some of the advocates that we have are Lorene Allen from Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water. And we have Katie Pelch, who is a PhD senior scientist at the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Okay, so I am going to introduce Congressman Pappas. He's been an early leader in the 116th Congress on PFAS contamination. In January, he joined a bipartisan PFAS task force made up of lawmakers around the country committed to addressing this issue and keeping our communities safe. He has already convened 2 listening sessions to hear from community leaders on the Seacoast and in Merrimack, and who have been instrumental in bringing this issue to national prominence and to the attention of the EPA. He's taken a series of steps to address this issue, leading bipartisan legislation in the House to create a PFAS registry for military service members and for veterans seeking information, resources, and updates to address health concerns. Congressman Pappas also joined a group of legislators to introduce the Vet PFAS Act to require the VA to provide benefits to veterans and their families who have been exposed to PFAS contaminants at military installations. The congressman also co-sponsored legislation requiring the EPA to designate PFAS as a hazardous substance, as well as a bill that would create robust funding for PFAS remediation on military bases. He knows that there is much more to be done to keep our communities healthy and safe from PFAS contamination, especially here in Merrimack and the surrounding communities, and he has expressed a commitment to working across the aisle with this bipartisan PFAS task force to get it done. He's here today to listen to your experiences, concerns, comments, and questions so that he can better address this issue in Congress in a way that will help our community. It is my distinct honor to introduce Congressman Chris Pappas.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate everyone who's come out here tonight to join us for this discussion. Thank you to our state legislators who are here, to our former representatives who have joined us here today, as well as those who have served our town right here in Merrimack and those who've gotten active around this issue. It's an important one that we have to keep talking about. In the early days of this Congress, when we were still in the midst of the longest government shutdown in American history, something positive happened, and Republicans and Democrats came together to create the Congressional PFAS Task Force, which I think is critically important for us in Washington to be able to share experiences and focus on legislative solutions of how we can keep people safe and make sure that we're holding big polluters accountable in this country. This is going to be found in every congressional district across the country, as long as we're testing and getting information out there. And I think we in New Hampshire are sort of on the leading edge of identifying this in our communities, identifying the health risk that is posed over a period of decades to residents of this state, and by speaking out and demanding solutions. And I think we have to work together with our colleagues across the aisle to make sure that we're addressing this problem head on, because it's going to be found in every corner of the United States of America. Some of the early work that I've done on legislation has kind of fallen into 2 buckets. One is around military exposure. We all know the problem that exists around peas, and that is a problem that's shared by most military bases across this country. The firefighting foam that was used at peas and other bases contained high levels of PFAS, and it has polluted groundwater all across the country. And many veterans don't even know that through their service they have been exposed to these harmful substances. The Registry Act that Carol Shea Porter introduced in the last Congress, I introduced with Jean Shaheen just a few weeks ago. It would allow individuals through their service to understand their exposure and get up-to-date health information. In addition to that, I filed legislation with a bipartisan group in the House and Senate to allow our veterans and military service members to access benefits through the VA because of their exposure and because of health conditions that they have contracted by being exposed to PFAS through their military service. I think any veteran who has served this country and was put at risk needs to be taken care of, and that's a solemn promise I know we all share that we need to make good on going forward. In addition to that, we've got to look for ways to hold the EPA accountable to make sure that we take a tougher stand with respect to the regulation of these compounds. That's why I signed on to legislation in the House to make sure that we treat PFAS as the hazardous chemical that it is and treat it under the Superfund law that would allow us to bring greater attention to industrial contamination sites like the one here in this particular community. In addition to that, I think we got to do more to get health studies out there that are well funded, that will move forward, and that will look at the long-term implications of exposure. I know there's a lot of concern about what this all means for people and their families. It has been years since this was first identified in the town of Merrimack, and but for, I think, the very dogged determination of advocates and community leaders here in town, I don't think we would have had the level of attention and the answers given that we have to date. So I think we have to do more of that. We have to be willing to ask the tough questions, to pose the uncomfortable statements, to make sure that we're getting this addressed from the highest levels of our government on down. And to the extent that I can carry forward the message that I hear today, the stories that I hear in this room, in this community, and towns all across New Hampshire, I'm really looking forward to doing that. I think there's nothing more critical that we can do as a government than protect our air and protect the water that we drink. That is a basic promise, and government has failed far too many communities. We got to do a better job of making sure that we're protecting public health and ensuring that we can prevent certain diseases that result from long-term PFAS exposure. So with that, I would love to open it up and hear from all of you. I know you probably have quite a bit you want to tell me. I've spoken to a number of you over the last many months on this issue. And going forward, even beyond today, I hope that you'll stay in touch. I want to introduce some of my staff members who are here today. My district director, Carrie Thurman, Patrick Carroll, who's our constituent services director, and Christine C. Schultz, who also works in our office on a variety of issues and handles constituent matters. Here with us today, we're opening up an office on Elm Street in Manchester. In the coming weeks, we have our headquarters in Dover right now. So we're certainly open and accessible to all of you well beyond today. But once again, thanks to the local officials and state officials who have come out here today. And with that, I would love to throw it open and start to hear from you all. And I believe this is being recorded from the town's TV station.
It is being recorded. Is this on?
Can you pick up that mic there?
Is this one on?
Okay.
Is it okay? All right. So as you know, this is a contaminant in our water, and it's creating havoc with our health and things like that. But the other things that it's creating havoc with is there's an economic impact. As an example, my house, I live 3.5 miles from St. Gobain. I wasn't supposed to be impacted. My well is so impacted I cannot use the water from my well. So I have to have 2 filtration systems in my house. Who do you think is going to buy my house? So there's some of us that are stuck, economically. The other impact is with health. There's a lot of people, if you get sick, you can't go to work. If you don't go to work, you lose your health insurance. And right now with healthcare, that's another huge issue. People cannot afford to be sick anymore. So it's huge. It starts with PFAS, but it spirals out very quickly to the entire, the whole environment and the whole socioeconomic, system that we have in our towns. So it's not really a question. It's just a comment that this is bigger than just chemicals.
Thank you for raising that. I think we all see the linkage between the economic vitality of the state and us being and maintaining a clean environment here. We had Earth Day just yesterday, and in New Hampshire we thrive as a state because of our natural environment. And there are toxins that we can't see, unfortunately, that are in our drinking water that can have long-term economic consequences if we're not willing to do the remediation work and make sure that we prevent the pollution from happening again in the future. Thanks for raising that.
If you want to talk to the microphone. If you just want to use that, sure thing.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight, Chris. I'm Pat Teeden. I've made my living for years running clinical trials with some large companies and with the NIH. Can you offer any specifics about how close you are to starting the appropriate trials so that we can quantify the effects of the PFAS?
Yeah. I can't speak to that today. We've been having a number of conversations with folks through our DC office and also with EPA Region 1 about how we can move forward to do the type of study that will be comprehensive and that can collect all the data and information that we need so that we can set appropriate standards moving forward. I think one of the most alarming things for me is that the prevailing health advisory at the federal level is still set at 70 parts per trillion, which we all know is well above where the science tells us it should be, maybe 10 times above for many of the PFAS compounds. Studies are moving forward. There's always a question about, well, are they going to survey this community? Are we going to look at what has happened on our local military base? And I think we definitely have to fight for the attention that a community like this deserves as studies move forward. But I think you can make the case that we all benefit from the health information that will come out of them once the data is released. So, we're continuing to talk with folks. ATSDR is going to be producing information in the coming months and years. I think that's going to be very valuable and instructive to us all. But we've got to make sure we use it in a way to our advantage right here in New Hampshire to protect public health and to make sure that elected officials are, taking the appropriate course of action that's needed to make sure that we're a lot more aggressive about how we identify this and regulate it moving forward. Maybe if people, Rosemary, if you just want to introduce yourself as you
Oh,
give
thank
your
you,
comment.
Congressman. Yes, I'm Rosemary Rung. I've been in Merrimack since 1983, and I'm a new state representative. So thank you very much for coming. I have three things I want to bring up. Once you talked about the registry for veterans. Is there a way that firefighters can be added to that? The reason is that they've been exposed to a lot of firefighting foam, and a couple weeks ago it was reported that in the town of Stratham, they've discovered extremely high levels of PFAS in their groundwater that they suspect came from the fire department, the fire station there. And so it seems as though those firefighters are on the lines every day, like our military are, and they should, I think they would benefit from that registry as well. And the second thing I want to bring up is the whole concept of regulating PFAS as a class. We've already seen in one well in Litchfield that Gen X has been found in the well. So a lot of these, as I think the message has gone out that PFOA and PFOS are being regulated, PFOA is not manufactured anymore. Some of these like compounds are being made that just are modified a little bit molecularly, but still have the properties that a company would want, that look for in PFAS. So it reminds me of the days of dioxin when EPA regulated that as a class and eventually banned it. It also reminds me of just a few years ago when we had a class of those designer drugs. The government would ban one, and then the molecular structure would be altered a little bit to make it exempt from that, and then that's cause the same problems. And so I would really I would urge you and Congress to put pressure on EPA to regulate it as a class. And then finally, looking to the long term, there's been some great research being done in developing a new field called computational modeling of chemical health effects. And what it does, it takes known information and it actually develops these computer modeling to predict what a health impact of a chemical would have on either fetus or thyroid tissue. EPA's doing a lot of this research. It's great. It's fairly new, but I think that it can be an important tool for us to predetermine the health effects of chemicals. So we don't have to wait until they're detected in groundwater and people start suffering health effects. We could address this proactively and be able to regulate them appropriately before they even are used in commercial manufacturing applications. And Congressman, I know that you're on a plane a lot. You may suffer from amnesia once in a while. But I printed out some of the studies,
Oh, great.
the science research. So take it back.
Thank
It
you.
describes the new technology. There's a bibliography of some of the leading scientists that are working on it. And then there's a little primer to explain it. But I think it would really behoove us to take advantage of that and invest in that research now so that we don't have to go through these gyrations in the future, you know, trying to catch up and having people already suffer. Let's be preventative about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I think that's very smart. Thank you very much. I think that's a smart approach. I think we should look for ways to do that. We absolutely need to be regulating these compounds as a class. And I get what you're saying about how this is sort of a, you know, the goalposts keep moving on us, right? They keep, you know, tweaking these substances over time, and we've got to be understanding in real time what the dangers are. And I think we should empower our agencies to regulate these in a way that, you know, prevents toxic chemicals from being spewed from smokestacks and polluting groundwater in communities like this. So thanks for your work.
Good evening. I just wanted to take the opportunity to extend a very heartfelt thank you for the attention you are giving this issue. I'm utterly floored at how quickly you have spun yourself up on this issue. Frankly, I'm hearing you not only tonight but also in televised addresses that I've heard you give more coherent attention than some of our officials from DHS. Who are the experts on this. So that's really impressive. And the fact that you've continued to make this a central issue when it's not an election time. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the comments, and I don't purport to be an expert on this, but I do purport to represent each and every person in the congressional district, regardless of what town they come from, regardless of what political party they might belong to. And you know, we have to own up to our responsibility as a government to protect people. That's the bottom line. And so I've learned a lot from folks in this room. I will continue to do so, and I hope you'll stay in touch and just let me know what's happening on the ground here as best you can. I do want to introduce State Senator Shannon Chanley, who came in and has joined us as well. No, we appreciate your presence. Thank you. Other comments? Yep.
So as dire as the situation is, and it is dire, Merrimack is the flagship town for taking action. We just recently passed 2 warrant articles to spend $14.5 million to clean up our water. So this town has got its head screwed on tight. That we know what to do. We're doing it, and other area towns they're watching us because they're going to have to do what we're doing right now, and we're leading the way. So. This town is, we're making changes.
In the back, yep.
Joel Folliard, live directly across the street from the
Okay.
St. Cobain plant. And I guess I really don't have so much of a question, but to point out that we have been told not to dig in the ground where I live without extreme protection. And St. Cobain plant is releasing some kind of material, usually at night, usually on the weekends. And I mean, do I have a list or can I guarantee it? But that's when it has been mostly happening. That is some kind of a burning plastic. And just bringing it up so that it's made aware, I can't dig in the ground at my condo because of that. Thank you.
Thank you. And the nature of these substances, we all know, they don't break down immediately. We're talking about centuries and millennia that these compounds will be with us and be present. And so that's a very serious concern moving forward. I think I saw another hand here. Yep.
I want to thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate you being here. As Wendy was saying, Merrimack did just take matters into their own hands with treatment on the rest of our wells that are still below the 70 limit. You're probably well aware that St. Gobain has agreed to pay for treatment on 2 of our wells that are over the limit. But as you explained earlier, with that limit remaining at 70, it's a lot of people feel that it's too high. Obviously, the customers felt that way. That's why they approved the treatment. It's important that that the limits do get lowered so that we can try to seek restitution from the polluters. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know where the limits are going to go. The proposed limits are close to where our levels are in our wells. So I guess I can only try to make an appeal to you to see if there's any kind of federal funding that's available that the Merrimack Village District could seek to offset some of the costs to the customers. That's going to be a very important focus that I know as a commissioner I'm going to be looking forward to that in years to come to try and hold those polluters accountable. So if there's any other way that the legislation you talked about finding the polluters and holding them accountable, or just any kind of federal grant money, I don't know how long it's going to take for the EPA to get around to some realistic limits that if they are going to be lower or not. But we really need help in this town, because we made the decision to go ahead and move forward with this. So even without those grants, people were still adamant on wanting to get the water treated. But now that we've made this leap, it would certainly be a lot easier to offset those costs and to hold the polluters accountable.
Yeah. No, thanks for raising that. We, as we talk about infrastructure moving forward, I think this is one space where, we can help solve infrastructure issues, but also look at making sure that we keep people safe and prevent pollutants from getting into the water. And that's by, investing in, our water infrastructure and our wastewater treatment facilities. I sit on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I'm on the Water Subcommittee. And so we're going to be talking about moving forward a bill in May that's going to contain elements that will impact water treatment and water systems across the country. So we'll look for ways, to take into account what's been happening here. And also we'll be in touch with you from our office here in New Hampshire about any opportunities that we see on the horizon where we may be able to find a match for a program that would work for Merrimack. I applaud you for the decision that the town has taken here. That's a very serious financial commitment to make, but public health is very critical, and how can you put a price tag on that, right? So we'll look for ways to work with you over time on this. I think when we talk about standards, the EPA recently put out an action plan, several bullet points that they would like to take up in the coming months and years. One of them is setting a maximum contaminant level. I think it makes far more sense to set that in an aggressive fashion at the federal level, as opposed to having a patchwork system state by state, where New Jersey has one standard, Vermont has another, and New Hampshire's trying to reckon with, how do we come up with something that makes sense for us. The science should be the science, whether it's New Hampshire, Vermont, or New Jersey, or any other state. And so I think we should all look for ways to come together around a common set of facts, around basic science, and make sure that we're doing it in a way that doesn't disadvantage any community or any state. Yes.
Hey, Chris, just wanted to thank you for coming out tonight. Since we're talking about a contaminant that has a lot of health effects in our communities, I know you agree that healthcare is a human right, but if we want to make sure that everyone that's been exposed here, but also nationwide, is able to get healthcare, don't you think it's time to get off your PFAS and endorse Medicare for all?
The absolutely, there's a role for healthcare to be playing in this debate. I've heard from a number of families who have been seeing their primary care physician, and those doctors aren't equipped with all the information they need to be able to provide relevant health information to keep people safe. And so, just building off on your question there, I think it's really important that when we talk about health information, that we include the medical community here to make sure that individuals are able to look out for their kids and make sure that they're monitoring their levels over time. Part of that is by allowing, I think, additional blood testing to move forward in affected communities like this. That's something I would absolutely support. But I do see healthcare as a fundamental human right. We need to look for ways to make sure that everyone is covered and that that coverage is affordable. And that's why I've taken a stance to expand Medicaid in New Hampshire. We'll continue to do so in the future. Yeah, well, I've talked about that in a political context, but really the focus here tonight is on making sure that I'm getting stories back from folks here in town. Yeah, no. Well, happy to have a separate forum on that another night.
I tried to stop by your office to discuss it with you.
Yeah.
Any staff was able to sit down
Great.
with us for over 45 minutes.
Yeah.
No one in your office was able to talk.
I am more than happy to talk at length about you with this afterward, but
Okay.
I just want the focus to stay on this particular issue here tonight.
It is. It's health.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm glad that you talked about primary care doctors. I'm a primary care doctor. I also live on a street that's one of the 20 places that they're watching for PFAS. I live on that street. I know everybody on that street. Only half the people have had their houses tested. We were on a vacation when they came by, and I called as soon as I got back, and they said, tough luck, we don't have the money. Now, two of the people, their levels were so high, and this is 8 miles from St. Gobain, that the state paid for them to have filtration systems. Then some people on the street had a level of 19. Somebody had a level of 24. None of it makes sense. How can you have a 90, 90, 24, 19? And then you won't test the other houses. I think all the houses have to be tested again on the same day, and there needs to be somebody monitoring it to make sure they're doing it properly. And I would volunteer to do that. Thank you. Dr. Ann Terry.
Okay. What street is it that?
Trowbridge Drive
Okay.
in Merrimack.
Okay. Unfortunately, that seems to sound familiar to some folks in the room. Yep.
And we were never notified that we were part of this 20 until the Water Warriors told us. Now, fortunately, someone on our street had died of cancer, so I never trusted the well, and I had reverse osmosis. But my neighbors didn't have that.
Yeah.
So we need to get the truth out there, and the doctors know nothing about this. You give us the tools, we'll find out. But we have no tools, we're not allowed to test. We don't have a lot of information.
Thanks for raising that. And obviously, one of the issues that we're contending with is, as individuals get hooked up to a public water source or no longer using private wells, that changes sort of how water is distributed through other wells in communities. So someone might not register a high level today, but they may in weeks or months, depending on what the water table is looking like and how other wells are running. There's a piece of legislation in that empowers the U.S. Geological Survey to look nationwide at groundwater, and so we get a better understanding of how things flow so that we can ensure that we protect folks going forward. But I appreciate you raising that concern. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Catherine Pelch from
Hi.
TEDx. Just to follow up on that comment to start with, I think it's really important that when we have federal testing, like the UCMR 3 that tested for several PFAS, that they are testing at their detection limit. Because I think that you're probably aware that at this point, they're only detecting up here, but the levels are down here, and so that it affects the number of people that come up as showing a positive detection. And so the UCMR 3 data really underestimated the number of people who have contaminated water, that are drinking contaminated water. So moving forward, we really need to advocate for low detection limits and those kind of exposure studies.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm Representative Bruce Cohen from Nashua. First of all, I'm very empathetic to our neighbors here in Merrimack. It's a critical situation. It needs to be dealt with. I'm very fortunate to work with the Water Warriors up in Concord, serving with Representative Thomas and Rung on the same committee that deals with water. And we're committed to get the state to do whatever it can to help Merrimack. But I want to reinforce something you said. The standards are different everywhere, and we're having trouble getting the state of New Hampshire to agree to a reasonable standard. Like you say, New Jersey has a lower standard. Michigan has a standard that's different than that. We need the federal government to really step in and say, this is a problem. This is what the standard needs to be, and get a reasonable standard, not games that are going on here. So I appreciate your help in working with Representative Custer, as Congresswoman Custer as well, to get that to happen up there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to follow up on that comment as well, so thank you. In terms of a federal standard, yeah, the science should be the science, but it's never going to be the science. There's professional judgments and assumptions that are made like 10 different places in setting an MCL. And different states have used, sorry, I don't know if this is working. Different states have made different judgments. And in some cases, the starting point that New Hampshire set was good. It was lower than some other states, but then you add in these other assumptions and our values come up very high. So one of the analyses that I was working on today is looking at what New Hampshire has proposed, all their assumptions and the inputs into their model. And if you only change the exposure assessment, we find out that the children here from birth to 10 years of age are drinking PFAS at levels that we would not want them to be, like way high. And so just that one assumption, whether we calculate, whether we assume that people are drinking the same amount as a lactating woman, or whether we assume that we want to protect a breastfeeding infant, makes a huge difference in the level that we're going to set. And so I think that there's like particular parts of that MCL calculation process that we can advocate for being protective as we move forward.
Thank you.
So on the regulatory side, I wanted to point out something that DHS has actually mentioned in some of the information sessions they've had. Perhaps the biggest travesty of this is that even though PFOA is no longer in use, Saint-Gobain continues to emit PFOA from their stacks due to previous contamination. So not only is this problem not getting better with time, it's actually getting worse with time. And DHS's stance, or DES rather, DES's stance has been that they can't take any enforcement action because they don't have the regulatory backing to be able to stop Saint-Gobain from continuing to cause the harm. And that is kind of a travesty.
Mindy?
Hi. Thank you, Mindy Mesmer from Rye. I think now SB 309 gives them the authority to stop it, but they will in a minute. No. So we just got data that says Saint-Gobain is not only still emitting PFAS, but it's emitting the legacy compounds. It is also emitting very high levels of volatile organics, which we know are carcinogens, and that's very concerning to me. That's why you smell it, because the PFAS doesn't smell. So I wanted to follow up on something that Katie had said as well, and so that addresses what you had brought up. I agree with what you're saying. There is definitely other stuff coming out of those stacks at night and probably during the day, and that probably also affects the timing of when they sample and where they sample and the wind direction and all that stuff probably causes the variation in some of the results you see on different roads. So I agree it needs to be opened up to a wider area, and we in fact tried to get some legislation passed to be able to set some goals and standards for how they were going to do that. It failed last year, and we also tried to get the blood testing done 2 years in a row, and it's also failed. But what I want to ask for, Chris, I think they need, thank you so much for everything you're doing. Believe me, I'm so grateful, and everybody here is too. But we need ATSDR to come in, or some outside independent federal agency to come in and assist, because this is wrong, and it's not getting any better. And I think the attitudes of some of the state regulatory agencies is not going to help us any. And I think we need a health study first and foremost here in Merrimack, the people need to know, the breastfeeding mothers need to know if they should be breastfeeding their children. We see some very concerning data just come out of Minnesota, which is what Katie's referring to, that talks about the very high levels that these babies at very vulnerable stages are getting delivered from contaminated breast milk. Very concerning to me. So we need to really have some help in here for the people from a federal outside agency to really look at the health impacts in the town, to look at the cancer rates, to really, I think the DHHS has admitted they really don't do this kind of study, so they really need someone else to come in and help. And maybe an idea for you on that, getting the bill in to get some infrastructure assistance should tap some money out of 3M and DuPont, who have caused this to begin with. Maybe that's where we could get some of the funding, but just some ideas.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Yep.
Hi. I was just looking it up. There's a March 14th article in the New York Times that talks about how the Pentagon, NASA, and the Small Business Association have lobbied the Trump administration to overrule the EPA lowering the standard. And in fact, they're proposing a 280 parts per trillion standard.
What's the date of that?
March 14th.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's
I haven't caught
connected
that
with your
one yet. We should look that one up.
committees, but it's scary to think there's so much. It's hard enough to get everybody lined up when you recognize the threat.
Yeah.
Never mind people saying that's too much money. We're not going to go in that
Yeah.
direction because it's too much money.
I think
Yes, sir.
part of this problem also is do we have the enforcement capability to actually inventory what these companies are receiving, not only the inventory they currently have on hand of these chemicals, but additional purchases and that sort of thing. There are no shortage of cases where corporations put under a great deal of pressure. Classic example was companies dumping in snowstorms on Route 128 chromates back in the, I don't know, what was 30 years ago, something like that. So I'm concerned that some of these companies, once the pressure gets put on them and they're put on their processes and everything, can potentially do something stupid if they're not, if we don't have a police force in effect.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Yeah. We had another one behind you too, if you want to pass for now.
I just wanted to follow up to two comments that were made earlier. The gentleman in the back who made the comment or was informed that he was told not to dig in his dirt, that whatever's sitting in that dirt will be going into our groundwater. So this is far from over. And that's really interesting. I live in the same town, and I don't live as near to St. Cobain, but that was total news to me just now. So I feel like a lot of this has been handled very hush-hush. And I know, obviously, you're not involved at the state level, but you're representing us, and we appreciate it. But, yeah, we need push on every level, because I do feel like our state is kind of backing away and not really protecting them. I've had face-to-face conversations, and it's gotten us really nowhere. So the more you can do on a federal level, we'd appreciate it.
I remember. Sorry. So at our MVD meeting, one gentleman stood up at the mic and he said, this company is in our town. They're polluting our air. They're polluting our water. They're polluting our land. Is it worth it to have them in the town? And I said, well, that's an interesting question. So I've been trying to find out how many taxes St. Cobain pays the town of Merrimack and how many federal taxes they pay. I can't get that information. If you could help us get that information, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I can have my office see what's available on that front. Yes.
One other thing to follow up on the soil comments, is there was just some documentation released by DES a couple days ago that showed that the soil is more concentrated in PFAS near the surface. So even if we stopped all the PFAS emissions today, we're still going to see an increase in groundwater levels because the mechanism of the groundwater contamination is the seepage from the soil. So I think that has to be something that's kept in mind as Congress and federal agencies are addressing this issue, because it's not going to make the problem go away if you limit it or even ban PFAS. We need to be able to support those communities in cleaning up the water, because it may be so impractical to remove the soil because it spreads so far. It gets carried by air. So I think also bringing attention not just to the MCLs, but also to how we can remediate the water and making sure resources are available to communities, like Dawn mentioned, to help us. I mean, we pass those bonds because we don't want to wait for government to do it for us. We want to get our water cleaned up as soon as possible. But I do expect that we should be we should have our damages covered. We should get Saint-Gobain to pay for this. And it's not going to just end with Merrimack. It's going to be so many other communities are going to find that they're going to be addressing PFAS contamination in their water for years and years, even if PFAS goes away. So we need to support them with funding for cleanup.
Yeah. Thank you. Another thought here?
To mention too, Chris, we had a conference call the other night with ATSDR to talk about the National Health Study, and there's no plans right now for them to look at delivery through breastfeeding or bottled water that's contaminated to babies. We asked them to do that, and they said there's no plans, but that would be a really important part of that National Health Study, so we get real good data on how to address this. And I just wanted to say to the rest of the room, Nancy Murphy is sponsoring a bill, HB 737, which will deal with creating a commission that will make some of these communication issues come to the surface, I think, more. Will bring everybody to the table. They will be open meetings and force a lot of this information to come out into the public. So please go to New Hampshire Safe Water Alliance's Facebook page and support. There's an action item in there that says support HB 737. Write your senators and your House representatives. Tell them you want them to pass that bill. It's really important.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Lorraine.
Hello. How are you?
Hi. Great. How are you?
I know your office is getting so many things from me, Lorraine Allen, from Merrimack, and I appreciate everybody reading it. I know they are. So we pushed, as you know, because a lot of folks from your office and other congressional folks backed us up and asked the EPA to release information to New Hampshire that New Hampshire said they didn't have. It was the air analysis in particular. Testing was done in April and May of 2018. The EPA received samples that were gathered here and sent off to North Carolina, the ORD lab. So with your help, we do know some of those results. The rest are supposed to be coming out shortly. So I was able this weekend to review this 145-page document, and in it I did see, as someone mentioned here, we have the first documented proof, which we know has been there, of Gen X in a well in New Hampshire. So a lot of people would say, well, that's horrible. That's the new stuff, right? That's bad. Is it as bad as the old stuff? I hear this from people all the time. So I will go even further, and I'll talk about your job is to oversight on some level the EPA, along with your colleagues, not you alone. So Gen X in 2005 was known to the EPA to be so harmful that by 2006 they issued a consent decree. It is still on file. This was part of legal action in North Carolina and part of why they were able to get Chemours to put in thermal oxidizers and very expensive equipment on their air stacks. So I knew this last year, and one of my concerns was, why is New Hampshire, their partnership with businesses and staying out of court? I've heard that for years. Okay, I have my opinions on that, but that's the way they do it. So what intrigued me was, why the secrecy? So I've had my eye on Gen X for quite some time. I've been told, oh, it hasn't shown up in tests. It hasn't shown up on site. In fact, it was in the air stacks in 2016. I did research that and find it. Well, it hasn't been off site. So wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. So with this latest proof here, I think we have something really important, and I would like to ask your opinion on this. Given that the consent decree that's on file, it never was canceled or waived, says that if Gen X is used as a condition of use, not only by manufacturers, but users of Gen X, they have to be informed, and they know this, believe me, they know this, that 99% of that chemical needs to be recaptured, and if it isn't, they can't use it. I think this is why we have a lot of secrecy. If this is proven to be true, which it is, if it's in a well in Litchfield, it means they haven't captured 99% of this. They are supposed to cease and desist under this consent decree. This consent decree also says the users of it, as in the workers, are supposed to handle it differently than any other PFAS chemical. They're supposed to wear eye gear, hand gear, protective gear. I know that is not happening there. I've talked to OSHA about this. They can't do anything because we don't know what they're using, proprietary blend, yada, yada, yada. Workers don't even know. So they're not being educated, number one. Just like the workers who worked on the Flatley site moving that dirt around were not told to wear masks. They had no water, trucks, nothing. The residents across the street got more contamination in their houses, in their lungs, their children. Absolutely appalling. So Saint-Gobain is... The air permitting in New Hampshire, as you know, is done by the federal government. We're paperwork pushers here in the state. Their discharges of water into the Merrimack River, which, be it a Class A or Class B, it's under the Clean Water Act. It's pouring in there. We have 34 PFAS compounds, at least, pouring into that river as we speak. Rain, dry weather, they've done testing. We've done great testing in the state. It's phenomenal. But the issue here is they discharge in the sewer to our wastewater facility. Our wastewater facility creates biosolids and composting. You know this, it goes out all over. They didn't know this was in here. They're probably really worried. The town's probably, uh-oh, are we liable? Are we not liable? What do we do with this? Also, permitted. Sewage is permitted. Air stacks are permitted through the EPA. It's all permitted. No one's pulling their permits, and we've been under investigation for how long? We have 65 square miles of identified contamination area. Well, we talk about a contamination zone of 1.5 miles. Well, how does 1.5 miles resolve with 65 square miles? When I ask that question and ask it and ask it and ask it, the answer is it's rather arbitrary. Saint-Gobain agreed to responsibility for 1.5 miles. Mm-hmm. Well, that really minimizes the contamination zone. So I'm thinking, after reading this report, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, if Gen X is off-site, and here is the legitimate proof, I believe that's why they haven't tested in the river. They tested the data points minimally on site, and they stopped when they got to the edge. And they've been doing this very carefully. And I'm wondering, somebody there knows that Gen X is being used, obviously, and somebody knows that this consent decree exists. It can't be just me, lady from New Hampshire, no way. And if it is being abused, if that consent decree is being not, how do we call it? Well, let me say it again. So if more than 99% is being discharged to the environment, they're out of compliance with our very laws. The EPA has stringently said this. It's on file. It's a very clear document. There's no room for misinterpretation of this. It says you will be responsible, a 99% recapture. So anyone who lives here in this town who has smelled those smells and seen those sparks and read reports going back to 2003 over air emissions, if I asked anyone in this town, do you believe that they're capturing 99% of Gen X, which is being used for how many years? But that consent decree is 13 years old. So we know now that it's off-site. I would put that out there to anyone. Is this a congressional inquiry issue? I mean, that sounds rather extreme. I like the sound of it, quite honestly, but don't you like the sound of that? Because really, we have a decree that's used, chemical use. It's not about PFO and PFAS. It's about Gen X. It's being violated. I know it's being violated. The minimal data that I've seen says it's being violated. And I think this is congressional inquiry time, because I think if this company that is not a U.S. company, it's a French company, nothing against the French, but They're here on U.S. soil. They're making billions of dollars of profits. You know, look at their shares, look at their stockholders' prospectus reports. I've read them all. They put in money for liability. It's appalling. But they are violating a consent decree with a chemical that's been protected in their proprietary blends that we know is being used here. They make it in North Carolina. It's used here. They're getting attention down there. No one is looking at this here. And that, to me, is where it's at. I think it's really time for Congress to look at this, call them in and question them, and make them prove to you that they haven't released more than 1%. 1% is too much, in my opinion, but the law says 99%. I don't believe for a minute that it's been followed.
Thank you for bringing that up. I absolutely think that's an urgent question we've got to answer. You know, and while I'm not on a committee of jurisdiction that deals with air emissions, I am on the, you know, water infrastructure subcommittee. To the extent that we can interact with EPA in that space, we're willing to do it. But I'm also willing to work with the rest of the colleagues from the New Hampshire delegation on this if it means drafting a letter on this to ask about Gen X specifically. I'd like to do that because, you know, I think that's...
We're going to ask for the proof because you know that we asked for that air report to come out.
Yep.
You're aware of that, but we just got it because of some citizens here who've been asking and other citizens who've been asking and your office that backed up the request, and there it was buried in that report. The rest is yet to come, and as Mindy said, there's VOCs in those stacks of very alarming amounts that are definitely a violation of their federal permit. And now if we go into this well, we're working on it, we're giving them time to fix it mode. They've been fixing it since 2003. Long enough, you know, it was what cost to all of us.
Well, I'd like to work with you on this, and my office will be in touch, and we'll explore ways that we can push and prod and make sure we get some answers on Gen X.
New Hampshire on this, and the permitting is done federally. I think we can.
That's right. That's a good point. Yes.
Yeah, so to follow up on Gen X for a minute, in terms of the health science that we have right now, like basically the only thing that we have that EPA had when they did their draft health assessment recently was studies from industry. And so I know that EPA IRIS is in the process, or they have proposals out to start their systematic review process for several other PFAS, and that's awesome and fantastic, and we need to do everything we can to support that. But my concern is that there are health studies that industry have conducted on some of these, and in some cases they may be some of the only studies or the only key studies that we have available that have been done to date. And right now they're not publicly available, even if they have been submitted to EPA. So there's kind of two ways that we've gotten them so far, either through FOIAs or through EPA now has made the available studies for Gen X and PFBS available. So I think that that's important to keep raising that up and to bring that science to light, because if we are going to regulate them, everybody needs to be able to see those studies.
Thank you.
So you mentioned working with ATSDR earlier, and when the ATSDR report on PFAS came out, what was it, last year, one of the things that jumped out to me in looking at it in the first couple pages, when this issue first came up in Merrimack, and from that time, what the residents of Merrimack have consistently been told is that we don't really have to worry about breathing PFAS because that's not really a way that it gets absorbed. We don't really have to worry about it being in dust in our houses. You know, our kids are playing on the floor and getting dirt on their hands and they put their hands in their mouth. That's not how it gets absorbed. We don't have to worry about bathing our children in the water that's contaminated with this because it doesn't get absorbed through the skin. One of the things that stood out in that introductory piece of the ATSDR report is it didn't say that. What it said is the only vector that has been studied is consumption. We don't know if it's absorbed through the skin because there isn't enough research behind it. But what the consistent messaging to the residents of Merrimack has been is you don't have to worry about it. It's not absorbed that way. Not, we don't know if it's absorbed that way, but we know it's absorbed by drinking. And I don't know how much of a role at the federal level you can play with that because this is the state that's not getting that message clear. But you did mention ATSDR and anything that can be done to help either push for more research or to help get that message clearer would be great.
Yeah. I think expanding the scope, as has been mentioned, is an important thing to do. And out of an abundance of caution, I would hope that folks would use language that didn't, communicate the fact that, this is a safe thing to be around, and in other forms that we should be restrictive until we know that something is safe. Yes.
Hi there. Using that as a segue regarding consumption, one of the things I talked about with different department heads at DES when they came for a health fair a few weeks ago was what were the studies that were being done on animals? Because we are a rural community for the most part. There have been studies that have shown that plants do uptake PFAS and will test positive for PFAS. And using the same studies that have been done on infants and children under 10, it stands to reason that also small animals will also test for PFAS as well. And we find that is exactly the case that happened in Maine with a dairy farmer, where they were finding milk and cows that were testing positive. Well, we have a different vector for administrating or inducing those PFAS into the community, and that's that we have these small farms, these people who are backyard farmers. They've got their chickens in the backyard. They're raising their own plants and organically, and then you have other agricultural modes going on as well, such as honey, etc. So we not only need to have those studies done on human use, but we also need to look at consumption of contaminated foodstuffs and animals, meat, as well as a possible mode of consumption contamination as well. And I would just like to bring that out as well, because right now DES here in New Hampshire does not have a veterinary service like the military does in order to be able to do those types of studies. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a perfect thing that we need to bring up too is biosolids. So biosolids are now, as you know, high levels of PFAS being detected in them and spread across agricultural land. And it's not only just our animals, but like you mentioned, our plants and our produce that can take up PFAS. The other aspect of that is that PFAS are found in our food packaging material. And so I want to share with you this information that I recently learned about how defunct our food safety laws really are, and how PFAS are regulated as a class by the FDA, in that if one PFAS or a chemical of a class is found to be safe, then generally the class of chemicals is found to be safe. They are labeled as generally regarded as safe, and then once something gets the stamp of approval from FDA as safe for food contact, then it's basically free to move about the economy. And it's considered, well, you should use it, it's safe for food contact, you're fine. And that's really, really terrifying to me, because there are no required tests for FDA to make that declaration. None. There are recommended tests, and there a genotox study and like one other, and that's it. For these chemicals to then just be given carte blanche to move around and be used in numerous consumer products that we know that we can get exposure from. And so anything that you can do to put pressure on FDA to revisit the designation of generally regarded as safe, the non-intentional added substances, those types of things would be really helpful moving forward. And then, not quite to that point, but to follow up on something else that I said earlier, EPA IRIS is doing a fantastic job, but to hold that in contrast to TSCA, which I'm sad to say I'm not completely up to speed with in terms of what chemicals TSCA is going to be evaluating coming up, but just to know that they are not equivalent evaluation processes. And so the way that TSCA is evaluating chemicals is not up to the rigor as what EPA IRIS is. So to just keep that in mind when we think about the larger EPA.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Yes.
Hi, I've lived in Merrimack for 16 years. I have friends and family that live around here. I drive past the plant every single day for work.
Yeah.
The health effects caused by these chemicals are going to be widespread and long-lasting. Even if someone is, they live in New Hampshire now, they might move somewhere elsewhere. Medicare for All would treat these people far better. If you supported Medicare for All, you would directly be telling the people of New Hampshire, directly affected by this, that you want to help them. So please support Medicare for All so I don't die of cancer in 10 years.
Thank you, and I think you're absolutely right. These compounds are going to be with us for a long time. They're going to be in our environment, and we do need to make sure that we give everyone health care and access to preventative care and wellness and things that can save lives. And I think oftentimes in the political struggle around health care, we lose sight of the fact that we're talking about human lives. And if we can get each and every person covered, I think that's a big step forward to ensuring that we can address a lot of the long-term health challenges that this nation faces. I mean, let's face it, we spend more in this country on health care than any other industrialized country in the world, yet we don't necessarily have better health outcomes, do we? And so I think that's something we've got to continue to talk about. I appreciate you raising that. Yes.
So another concern is that many of us now have filtered water in our own homes,
Mm-hmm.
those of us with private wells. Every 6 months I have to change the cartridges, so there's 6 cartridges. What do I do with those? They go into the transfer station. I mean, and what's happening is it's going back into the environment, So that's another issue too. What do we do with this stuff? I mean, what do we do with the spent cartridges?
That's a good question. I don't know that I'm qualified to answer it, but I'll say this. We have a number of landfills around the state where there's groundwater adjacent or on it that have tested at levels off the charts in terms of PFAS, where it has been dumped over the years. There's some communities that are trying to get out ahead of this, are doing their own testing and are finding it. So it's just about every place we test. I don't know what the solution is to it, but we have to be thoughtful about it because we're just going to create another concentration of PFAS if we continue to dump in certain
if everyone
locations.
in Merrimack with a private well filters their water, we're going to have stacks of these cartridges.
Yeah.
So we've got to figure out a system. And it's not just Merrimack. I mean, again, throughout the entire United States, this is going to be an issue.
I think you had a question or a comment?
I have lots of comments. First is, I don't feed my guinea pigs the water from Merrimack,
Really?
so that tells you that. My other question is, if I went to a reservoir and I put toxins in the water, I would be arrested and I would be thrown into jail for a very long time. Why are the CEOs of these companies, and I'm not just talking about St. Gobain, I'm talking about all of the companies that have all of these toxins, the Roundup, the drugs, why are they not in jail? I mean, are there steps that can be taken in Washington to make laws that would, it's one thing if their company has to pay a fine, it's a whole nother thing if they are personally held liable. I have to believe that a CEO knows and understands they're giving direction to the people that work for them. So I have to believe that they know what's going on and they should be held responsible.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a reason the company is here in town. It left Vermont at a point in time when that state decided it didn't want that company in its backyard. And now we're living with the consequences of it. I think absolutely we should be holding these corporate leaders to account and the companies that are dumping and polluting and creating these health hazards for us that we're going to be contending with for a long period of time. So let's look for ways to make sure that if we are upgrading water systems, if we are paying for health studies, that the polluters are the ones that are going to be financing those things and not the taxpayers.
Chris, you mentioned earlier about the ATSDR and getting some answers and some support for Merrimack. So we had a representative here at the PFAS Fair a couple weeks ago, and they were reviewing the P's health consultation document. We don't have ours yet. August 2016, it was requested. So I've asked them, and a year ago this month, they told me it was almost ready, but when Pease is done, ours will be next. So it still isn't done, and now what I heard is, oh, they're missing information, but nobody seems to know what they're missing. So that's one piece. The other piece is Brian was mentioning about the guidance over dermal absorption and all the other pathways. So the CDC has a very comprehensive document that many people in this room have got copies from me over the last over a year or so, and it gives guidance to states. And what this is for is if you're a PFAS impacted community, your state DOH or DHHS might be going, oh, what do we do? This is new to us. There is a huge document that the CDC has done, PEATT, whatever that stands for, I don't remember. Anyhow, in that document, it talks about dermal absorption. It talks about ingestion. It talks about all the pathways that we are talking about in this community, and it talks about chickens and eggs and fish and honey and breastfeeding. All of this stuff is in a CDC document. How do we get someone from Washington, and we need all of our representatives there to ask this, to come here and actually present that information that is in a guidance document? It's a very good one. It's phenomenal. It's been out for a couple years. They just revised it last July and tweaked it with new toxicology profiles that Katie's referring to. And it's there, and that information is being ignored. And I can see why. It may be alarming people. It may cause what are we going to call it, a publicity nightmare, but we need that guidance. And it seems like people have their hands tied. My impression from the ATSDR rep, who was wonderful and very knowledgeable, is that they're not seeming to be allowed to acknowledge that at this point. So we need you guys to pressure them and send someone here with the document from CDC that they have to do a presentation to this community, and perhaps do it with our officials and our DHHS and DES, because perhaps they didn't have a chance to read it.
We'll look for an opportunity to do that. Thanks.
So I wanted to change gears for a minute and talk about the Veteran PFAS Registry and the Vet PFAS Act, and hopefully give you some ammunition that you can use with that, since I know personal anecdotes are often a preferred tool. My wife and I are both former Marines, and less than a year after my wife got out of the Marine Corps, we had a little boy. And he was born with intrauterine growth restriction, very low birth weight, kidney reflux, spent about a month in the NICU. At the time, I didn't know what PFAS was, and it was only after we moved to Merrimack and this whole issue came up thanks to the efforts of the Water Warriors, that I learned that all of those health impacts actually are indicative of PFAS. Those are all health effects that are known to be caused by PFAS exposure. So I don't know that that's what caused those, but it certainly seems like a very high probability. And that's where, again, I said earlier, I want to give a heartfelt thank you for the effort you're taking here, and hopefully that's something that could be useful for you.
Well, thank you for your service and your family's service. And absolutely, I mean, I think we all understand that there are a few dozen people in this room here, but yet there are thousands of people that have been impacted directly by this in this community alone. And when you think about a military population, there are many that transferred from base to base without knowing exactly what they've been exposed to. I think that piece of legislation can at least help us move the dialogue forward and get people some answers. But thank you again.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very happy to see you again and happy you're here. Kathy Stack, we've met before and we've talked about my story a little bit, but I want to add another personal story. I have been affected by this situation for at least 3 years now. I have a private well, and I'd like to speak for the private well owners and many of the constituents that have contacted me that have no solution, no remediation, no path to recovery. And yet we have a polluter in town actively polluting day after day after day. And we, I'll say the private well owners, have nothing we can do. We're stuck in a pickle. I personally, I cannot sell my house. I would love to sell my house. I cannot sell my house. I can barely afford to make the mortgage on my house. Who wants to buy a house that the well is contaminated and you can't drink the water? Who is going to get a mortgage on a home that has a contaminated well? No one. I feel bad for the MVD. I complain to them quite often about not being hooked up to the public main. I heard recently from a pharmacist in the community, another constituent in my area of town, that rather than hook us up to the public main, the state has decided, DES, to work on a development in town, hook the development up first, rather than the people that are affected and suffering with the situation. We're going to hook up new development, bring new development into town. Let the active polluter keep on polluting and not assist the people that can't get help or remediation. We need help. I can't get an answer from DES. I'll speak personally for myself. I called them last week. I called them today. I called them as a private citizen. I called them as a representative. I cannot get answers from them. I cannot get them to return a phone call. It's not appropriate. It's not okay. And I think there's more to the story than what we're seeing. I appreciate you being here, and we need help.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any other hands, but I just want to thank you all for coming out, for being a part of this. Oh, we got one more over here.
I wanted everybody to have their say, Congressman.
Yeah, no, thank you, thank you.
No, I'm serious. I just wanted to observe. Bill Boyd, Town Councilor. For everybody in the audience, Saint-Gobain pays one tax to the town of Merrimack, and that's a property tax. That's it. So you can answer the federal tax question piece. Webster Green is a condominium that's across the street from Saint-Gobain, and I received a correspondence from a constituent looking to interact with DES to test dust. There was a collection of dust that had built up on the windows, and DES was kind enough to go out and examine the dust, and they issued a report in April of 2018 that, I want to make sure I get my facts straight, that the PFOA amount was 10 nanograms per gram, and that the PFOS was 13 nanograms per gram. They then go on to write that the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services has not developed a guidance level for PFAS and dust. However, although not directly comparable, New Hampshire DES has developed direct contact risk-based soil screening levels of 500 nanograms per gram. So they're trying to compare dust to dirt. You don't breathe dirt, you breathe dust. And I think what this constituent is telling me is a more larger concern that we don't have specific regulations, or if you want to call it advisories, however you want to phrase it, there's no specific guidance for the state to be able to provide an informed opinion on whether or not this level of dust that's on this woman's window is contaminating. In the town of Merrimack, we've been dealing with an issue as it relates to the Clean Water Act, and they've rechanged the MS4 permit in terms of how we're able to clean our groundwater and our wastewater that's being, coming down the Sauhegan River, Babusick out, how we regulate that. And it's a significant impact to the community of Merrimack. It dawns on me, why can't the EPA change the Clean Air Act and issue new regulations to attack the specific air pollutants that go in the air instead of relying on a certain criteria? If you're saying that the Clean Air Act of 1970 is still valid, still has impact, still has the ability to provide air quality to people in the United States, then why can't they change the rules in terms of how companies like Saint-Gobain are belching pollutants into the air? So I think it may behoove you as a congressman to use the weight of the first congressional district with the EPA to say, have you looked at the rules to see how you want to regulate not just PFAS but PFOA, but as the woman here from edX has said, Gen X. Gen X is the next big threat. Mm-hmm. And I think if we all agree that Gen X is the next big threat, then really the EPA should be using that act and creating new rules for everybody to play by so that you're actually having a substantive impact on what they're producing, what they're belching into the air. And I think in the grand scheme of things, you're going to be able to get some data, and then with that data, you can bring companies into compliance, or you can whack them in the wallet where it has significant impact. So that's where I think where your real weight can happen. And then lastly, this community was very fortunate enough to participate in the community health assessment. If there's any weight that the office could throw to the Department of Health and Services to bring a second round of community-based health assessment to this community so that we have an understanding of the type of cancers that may be impacting our community, I think it's going to go a long way to hopefully alleviating some of the fears that our constituents have as it relates to cancer. Not just for people like myself as a cancer survivor, but also for the little kids who really, the impact on them is far greater than on adults where our immunities are well developed and we can fight that sort of thing. So again, thank you for coming to Merrimack. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, Nancy.
Thanks again, Chris, for coming.
Yeah.
Just one last thing that I would ask. I know that we've discussed here briefly about House Bill 737, which is a bill that is right now sitting in the Senate. I understand from a phone call I got today from Department of Health and Human Services that it will be exec tomorrow and a decision will be made. This bill is a bill that the Water Warriors brought forward to specifically address the impact of the contamination of our community. It's a commission that will look at the true extent of the environmental impact of the contamination that was discovered in 2016, as well as the health impacts associated, specifically for Merrimack, Bedford, and Litchfield. I would ask everybody to go on social media tonight, take a minute and just write a couple of lines to the senators. The link is there to do that, to let it be heard that it matters to us. As Councilor Boyd was suggesting, in conversations, the thing that we need is the health study and blood test, and we have asked for that for 3 years. We've been told it was coming. We've been promised just to wait a little bit. In the spring it will be set, and then in the spring the blood testing was shut down. So despite a lot of time and a lot of requests and a lot of promises, the things that we really need to happen have not happened. And in many instances, I know in bills that I've supported and DES and DHHS has actually come out and opposed situations, lowering MCLs, and I know in this bill that right now, the 737, that is so important to us. It's one of those things that we'll actually see something happening here quick, rather than waiting for federal guidelines to take. This is something that we really need to make things right for Merrimack, to start addressing, for people to see that there are solutions, and that DES is listening, DHHS is listening, and that Merrimack matters. So, anything that you could do, if you go out to, get on there and write a little note yourself, that would be appreciated, and anybody in the community, we would be grateful. So thank you for coming.
No, thank you for your work. Yep. We have a couple hands over here.
So I testified. I was a co-sponsor on that bill. I testified at that bill, and it was very clear that the senators recognized that there's an issue. I mean, but they also recognized that something. I mean, the study that this bill covers is 7 years. That's a long time. And one senator came up to me after the hearing and said, if we wait for the commission to be done, people are going to die. And that's what he said. He said, people are going to die. So the thing is, we need this 7-year study. I mean, don't get me wrong, we absolutely need it. But we also need something done immediately. That's the problem.
Yes.
I just wanted to add to some comments that Councilor Boyd made. It's not just cancer. I know former state rep Mesmer tried to get, and just to take this back, when you're talking about health effects, it's not just cancer. I mean, just a random people-generated study showed thyroid endocrine issues in this town are through the roof. So it might not be that we're the pediatric cancer cluster that's happening in Coakley, but there are all kinds of health conditions going on in this town. So keep that in mind too when you're talking about a study, that it's not just cancer.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
No, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming out here tonight. We'll stick around for a few more minutes if you have anything else. I do want to mention that Leticia Ortiz from Senator Shaheen's office is here as well too. So we have one of our Senate members represented here at this meeting. But thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for voicing your concerns, not just here today, but over many years. I think that's what gives me hope that we're going to be able to actually move forward some policies and regulations that are going to help change the dynamics around this, not just for this community, but communities across the country. So you're not just speaking out for your own neighborhood, for your own family. You're doing this for all of the American people, many of whom don't really fully appreciate the scope of this emerging public health threat. Thank you once again for joining us here tonight. It was a pleasure to be with you.